This is part of Level Design Workshop. There's a lot of great level design talks, so please check them out all through the day. You'll get a lot of experience from a lot of great people. I hope to be one of them. And we're going to talk about God of War today. So it is a real joy to be here at GDC. And actually, we have a lot of learnings from God of War. It's a very big game, so we're going to try and compress a lot of it down into some simpler learnings for you today. A little bit about myself. I actually grew up in the Australian games industry. You can probably tell from my accent. And other than spending my late teenage years working at a cheese store, working in games is pretty much the only job I've ever had. And so if you are just starting out with your career or just getting started in level design, I put these kids games up here because it's a great way to get started. And even though you might think that God of War would have tons of people from tons of different huge AAA games, which some people do. A lot of people actually come from smaller backgrounds and from kids games, THQ games, even smaller games than that. So if you're ever wondering where to get started, I always say just get your hands dirty, and maybe I can show you some tricks today on how to do that. In addition, even though AAA games themselves can be very big, heavy development experiences, there's a lot of production behind them. There's a lot of rules and level design tropes that I learned on smaller games, and I like to say that good design is effective at any scale, and I hope that you can see how some of the tricks we're going to look at today work on big projects or work on small projects. Finally, we actually did have a lot of risks on this God of War game. It's fabulous that it's come together so nicely. We have a lot of fans, which is always a great feeling. But a lot of the rules I'll show you today are actually what I would call very traditional. And there's some that have been successful on many games other than God of War. This talk is primarily about the stonemason level. You can see here this fabulous environment art is from Isabelle LeMay. It's one of my favorite levels in the game. And it is about 50% of the way through the game. So there's some minor spoilers, but nothing too major. I won't go into anything too heavy, but to talk about how the item use works in the game and how the exploration works in the game, I have to dive into it a little bit. As we step through the stonemason level, I'll keep coming back here a lot. This is what I call the level design rule slide. We'll come back here a few times. And basically what we're going to do is go over 6 major rules from God of War's levels. There'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end. If we run out of time, I can meet you at room 305 or 308 and we can keep discussing. And my hope is that by showing you these rules and by showing you the stonemason level, I can sort of use it as a microcosm for the level design of the game itself. So we'll check back on this every now and then. It's sort of the anchor to the presentation. And then we'll go into the level. I'll show you how the level rules work out in practice. And I'll show you some of the beats leading up to the level. And you'll kind of get how the overall flow packages up from level to level. So to get us started, here's our first rule. It's all about core pillars. Sometimes a contentious topic in game design. Some people really like to use core pillars. Some people don't. I think they're great. I like core pillars because they let us know what to focus on. You could sort of think of them maybe as a lens of focus that help us to all start thinking in the same direction together. And we can't do everything in every game ever, nor do we really want to, right? Because if we do things with a bit of focus, what we'll hopefully end up with is a few things that make the game really special, something that actually helps to separate it from every other game out there. And so you can think of the core pillars as creative building blocks. And as we step through this talk, I'll be going over core pillars a lot. But before we do, here's a quick history lesson. God of War 1, 2, 3, and Ascension, the PSP versions, they all have core pillars that focus on a few key areas as well. You might describe them as combat, platforming, and puzzles. And as you probably remember, God of War was actually a game with a rail camera. So it was often seen as this best-in-class, bombastic action game, action-adventure game. But by 2014, there was a very strong feeling both inside the studio and outside the studio that we needed to start looking at these core pillars and the anatomy that really makes up the game itself. Now, for a franchise to switch up its core pillars is not the type of thing you want to do all the time, right? Because what you're actually going to start to look at is, are we reevaluating the things that players find most fun about this game? We're going to actually start unpackaging that. Going to take all the pieces of the engine, spread them out on the floor, and see how they all fit together. So with that in mind, Corey Barlog, our creative director, and a few key team members sort of siphoned themselves off for a little while, and they had the goal of creating a new set of pillars. The 3 pillars that they came up with, and I won't step you through the full process of how this was generated, but they were very successful, were combat, narrative, and exploration. And for level design, this is a very big change. It's great. It starts to give us a lot of things to start focusing on, but it actually also starts tapping into a lot of things that we sort of lack expertise in at Santa Monica Studio. But it's a good opportunity to start thinking in new terms and how we take on modern design challenges. We can't keep doing the same thing forever, so how do we start thinking with a new lens of focus? You can start asking yourself, all right, well, what would Combat 2.0 even mean? How does this work with a new camera? How do encounters work? How do we build fight spaces? Sure, a lot of people say they want to be a modern narrative game, but what does that even mean? How do you tell stories? What are the components that come together to make that happen? And a lot of people think of exploration just in terms of larger spaces, but how big is too big? How wide is too wide? What do you even do other than just exploring or roaming? And of course, at the center of all of this, you have Kratos and Atreus, trying to tell a father-son story. So you're trying to take combat, narrative, and exploration as your first pillars of focus, and at the center of it, you're trying to think of how this will all tie into a father-son story. Here's a quick version of Vision Book. This is the one that Corey put together. I think it was fabulous. In fact, you can see all through the book that combat, narrative, and exploration are very heavily represented. In fact, Corey believed so strongly at these three pillars that you pretty much can't get a cup of coffee at the studio without having to look at it, which is a particularly good way to start sort of brainwashing everyone. And I know this is something that designers really respected. The fact that Corey stayed to these three pillars gave us some really strong anchors through the project that we could work on. So with these three pillars in mind, as I step through the presentation, start to try to think about combat, narrative, and exploration a lot. This stonemason level did take a long time to put together. We spent a long time tuning it and iterating on it, even with these great pillars that we could focus on. But the thing that's great about this level is when it came together, it sort of became a fully architected expression that delivered on combat, narrative, and exploration. And most importantly, it proved to us that if you distribute those three pillars correctly, you can actually deliver on the variety of pacing that we're looking to master. Not just an action game and not just an adventure game, but a real mix of action and adventure, right? So let's take a look with a bit of a deeper dive how the game and how the level delivers on these three pillars. Start with the most obvious one, combat. Well, this, of course, details everything that is the most action-focused component of the game. It's the capital A in action-adventure. And it's everything from Kratos' core attack loop to the AI he faces, the upgrades that can be achieved, and perhaps most importantly, how a support character like Atreus might contribute to that fight. You can see here, inside the category of combat, there's actually a lot of sub-archetypes. It's not just arenas or fight spaces. There's also sort of more wide linear scenarios where you can take on the AI in more free-form ways. Down the bottom on the left there, you'll see what I call a special rules scenario. This one has a timer that sort of gets the variety a bit different from everything else. Of course, you have boss battles. You have lots of different things that come together to just make combat more than just fights, right? So the core pillar of combat is great. It gives us a lot that we can start thinking about early on. But what's really good about it is it has enough versatility that we can start to create sub-archetypes inside it. It's a great place for level designers to start to put their focus. And if you look at the Mason level here, you'll see that it's pretty heavily distributed throughout the level, exactly what you'd expect. There's a lot of different fights that take place, and they're paced out really well. Secondly, narrative. Well, you might not expect that out of a God of War game, especially with the history of the franchise. God of War has actually always had a strong narrative through it, but it's never really been narrative gameplay. So what we can start thinking about now is what is the father-son adventure that Kratos and Atreus are actually going to go on? It's the tone, it's the level's purpose, it's the overall lore. A good level has a story and has an adventure behind it, right? So we can actually start thinking about how to deliver on that. Again, there's a few sub-archetypes of narrative gameplay that we can look into. You've got cutscenes, of course, but we tried to innovate on this by having no camera cuts throughout these. You can see there's sort of more slow-paced sections where Kratos and Atreus can have conversations with one another. Down the bottom, a lot of games are starting to become masters of this right now. Environmental storytelling. How do we give the environment a sense of place? How do we tie it into the overall lore? And of course, you can see on the bottom right, even Atreus has little animations that we put in the levels to try and emphasize and accentuate his state of mind. There's even little secrets that allow the player to find lore. There's a lot of different categories inside that core pillar of narrative, and that's great. Again, like combat, it gives us a lot of different versatility and variety that we can create inside the level. If you look at it from the top-down perspective, you might even be surprised how much narrative is inside this level. And that doesn't even include the fact that you're in a level with a giant, interesting-looking fallen giant, right? So once again, you can see we're able to get a lot of variety and density out of that sort of initial pillar of narrative. And rounding out the three pillars is exploration. And this is what I would consider to be the most complicated of the three pillars. The pillar of exploration is great. It represents the desire for larger layouts, sure. It represents the desire for more wide linear spaces, of course. But it also represents the design shift in the camera. The fact that you can actually move the camera around now means every space is more explorable than before. There's a famous phrase taught to me earlier in my career by Morgan Jaffet, which is camera is genre. Where you place the camera is possibly what type of game you are making, right? And when we shift the camera from a rail camera game to a fully 3D game, now we have very explorable game just through the perspective of the camera. So you can start to once again break down exploration into sub-archetypes and start to look at how the camera provides new opportunities. It's more than just big spaces. There's little puzzles that we can put all through the level now that we can aim the camera in different perspectives. We have optional fights that you can opt into. Those are just great because they give you a bit of player autonomy. And finally, this level actually connects to the game's hub, which is the Lake of Nine, and we'll go into that a little bit later, but it's a larger sort of discussion about how exploration and level-to-level flow works. So once again, you can see that exploration is pretty heavily represented in this level. Of course, it does bunch up a little bit in the most explorable space, which is the Mason's mini hub right in front of his head. But also, if you look at the back end of the level, it's more than just building big spaces. We want you to seek out nooks and crannies in every room, even if it's a more linear space or a load hallway. We want to fill that full of secrets, lore, additional moments, and so forth. So when you put it all together, I think you have a level that accurately delivers on the three pillars: combat, narrative, and exploration. And if you use these correctly, you can achieve the variety and pacing that I think we're looking to master, a mix of action and adventure. The stonemason level is sort of what you might call one of the more level designery levels as well, right? It's particularly good at this. And it's not a full vertical slice, and we don't treat every level like a template or anything like that. But it was a particularly good level to get online early in the project because it really did prove to us that if you mix and match these three pillars together, you can get a lot of versatility and you can get a lot of variety. And this is in essence why I believe in core pillars so much. When you go to design spaces, front of mind for all designers should really be, how do I use these? How do I mix and match them? How do I start to think about them to create a lot of focus? And if you do this, you'll end up with a level that feels, a game that feels very different from level to level, but still feels consistent from the overall level to level experience. So with that in mind, we'll add rule number 1 to our deck, and we can start to look into our next most important technique, which is converting these pillars into recognizable metrics, and that's where rule number 2 comes in. Early on in the project, we had to make a decision about what type of construction of this game we wanted to use, and we made the decision that we were going to be a very metrics-focused game. So we can start to think, how do our core pillars and our metrics come together to help us architect spaces? A lot of people talk about design metrics. What does it even mean? Quick definition. I like to think of metrics as just a design measurement that communicates gameplay. If used correctly, you should start to build a rhythm in your head as to what the different measurements mean. And all games have this. You know, if you're playing Tomb Raider, maybe jump heights and jump widths might be super important. If you're playing a racing game, might be about widths of paths or you know, where we go on-road, off-road, all these types of things. Really important for what type of game you're making. So of course, the first question you should be asking is, how do we make metrics that emphasize and accentuate the core pillars of the game? Our task is to determine metrics that are most important for highlighting and promoting the goals of the game. So with that in mind, you can start to quickly wrap your head, once again, through the core pillars of the game. At its simplest level, well, for metrics for combat, we don't want snags or frustrations. Okay, how do we create a metric that creates that? For narrative, sure, it's easy enough to say we want no camera cuts, but how do we actually create a metric to deliver on that goal? And for exploration, this is a game without a jump button. When you're looking around the environment, how do we create more explorable spaces while also allowing you to scan the horizon and start to get a quick snapshot in the back of your head as to what those metrics might mean? If you get to a dead end and it doesn't actually reward exploration, you're going to be bummed out, not going to want to explore anymore, right? So those metrics start to build a lot of psychology in your head. This here is one of our most important team documents. It's called the Level Building Codes, and it was created by Michael Chang and James Writing. And it details all the metrics out in meters. You can see here that Kratos, he mostly uses 1 meters, 2 meters, and 3 meters, and we try to really stick to those values as much as possible, even in more organic spaces. You can see that he has 5 meters as kind of his drop-off heights and so forth. And as we start to get more complicated, all the different vaults and squeezes and wall presses, all these things have very clearly laid out metrics. So if done correctly, the visual archetypes are established and layouts remain clear. Once you're happy with the metrics, they go into a test bed and you can examine them further. Here's a quick example. As he runs through, keep an eye on the 3 meters, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So it's pretty straightforward stuff. You can see everything's nicely laid out. It's easy to test that the animations are going to line up correctly. And boom, there's our 3 meter one right in front of us. Let's take a closer look at the 3 meter. 3 meter boost is I love this one. It's really simple because it's a vault that Kratos can do to get to an upper ledge. It's not so high that you might feel like you're going to move to the next space or trigger the next cinematic or move on to like a big fight or anything like that, but it is just high enough that it removes you from the planar space. And it's perpendicular. It's a very strong, sharp edge, and it's roughly at Kratos' eye level. So the 3 meter boost is great. It can be used to separate the combat space a little bit. It can be used to reward a secret. And if used correctly, it starts to build a rhythm in your head as to what the role of the 3 meter boost may be. And there's a lot of other archetypes. This is why people call metrics sometimes level Legos or similar like that. Because when combined together, they make a very traditional BSP layout, or sheet layout as we call it. This is the stonemason level early on. And you can see that these metrics were very early attempts to start to see how these level rules may start to come together. Over here, you can see that there's some early attempts to get combat spaces and combat metrics laid out correctly. Up the top, you can see early examples of vaults. And down on the bottom right, you can see that these are some early attempts to start working out what his climb metrics and climb animations might look like. As we get further into development, these metrics were actually pretty successful. And so we started to look into more advanced ones. Over here, you can see that we added little jump gaps. This is maybe a little bit more rhythm that we can start to build into the nav metrics. The environment artists told us that slopes was something that was super important to them based on their research of the Nordics. So we started to look into what IK heights would be and how we could build with those in mind. And finally, a point of pride for me is you'll see over on the right-hand side, that initial metric that we created for the fight space has actually retained its design. And even as it got a more sort of detailed pass, it's actually held its structure. That's spot on. This is the value of laying it out correctly. So when you step through the stonemason level, you'll see there's a really basic core path. And now we can start to think once again how all these metrics come together to make combat, narrative, and exploration. Here's our 3 combat spaces. You can see there is a more wide linear space at the front of the level. Up the back, we've got a more traditional arena scenario that takes place at the head where we can increase intensity. And then actually, on the back right there, you'll see that this was a space that we also laid out to be another arena, which is a bit too similar back to back, right? So we had to introduce a character there to spice it up and make it a bit more interesting. In terms of the narrative pillar, you'll see that the Mason himself is pretty much a perfect narrative setup. It's a fallen giant whose last breath has frozen the entire world around him. It's a great setup. But despite what you may think, we don't know every line of dialogue or every piece of narrative that is written at the start of the project, right? So what we try to do is lay out the space so that there's tons of opportunity for banter or environmental storytelling or set pieces in general. And that means that the writers can come in at different phases in the project and still make interesting moments between the characters. And finally, up the back there, this is one of the cinematic transitions. This was a very early attempt to try and work out how we were actually going to funnel you from gameplay into cinematics with no camera cuts. In this example, Kratos uses a climb, and that's a great way to limit his movement so that we can start to create blends between gameplay and cinematics. And in terms of exploration, you can actually see here, this is where I showed you the jump gaps earlier. This was kind of a failed experiment. Even though the level designer Kai Zhang did an incredible job of this level, actually we found out that if you're a game without a jump button, it's just not that fun to move around and lean into the nav. So later on, we actually swapped these out with little bonus puzzles that involved throwing the axe, which we thought was a bit more in tune with the game's strengths rather than maybe its limitations. So once you string it all together, you have a layout that can actually fit all in Maya, which is great because we don't have camera cuts in this game. So it's really important that we can actually fit it all in one scene. And it's great for workflow. So you can probably tell from how much I'm going into this that I'm really proud of how the level designer Kai did with this. If you strip away the production of the level, there's a lot of really simple rules that make up this space. They're not super fancy and they're not super complicated. They're just a lot of repeatable metrics and repeatable pieces that come together to make an overall layout. And ultimately, it's the core pillars and those initial metrics that are the first building blocks of level construction. If you know your core pillars, and you have a generally clear layout, I believe you'll have a strong canvas for more complicated decisions, right? And if you do the groundwork to do that, you can start to take on more complex things like variety, pacing, mixing it up, all these things. Which brings us to our next set of rules, achieving variety. So I mentioned a lot that we're always looking for the mix of action and adventure, right? Never leaning too hard into making the action fatiguing and never leaning too softly into the adventuring elements. And since the game's been out for a while now, we do hear from players that they feel like it has a good mix of scenarios, including combat, narrative, and exploration, which is awesome. I'm really glad to hear that, and you never know until the game ships, right? So when you hear that, you're very relieved in some ways. And also players often tell us that they feel like it keeps moving from a moment-to-moment perspective, that it stays fresh. So with that in mind, I want to detail 2 rules that I think are really important for achieving variety. The first is that all levels sort of promote or sell a major theme throughout the level. I'm fond of saying good levels have a strong theme. So put simply, to create a theme or variety, there has to be some kind of unique gameplay element, something that acts as a start point or an inception, maybe like a nucleus for an idea. And our hope is that that will give us a breadth of different scenarios that we can create. And once that unique gameplay element or that unique level toy or whatever you want to call it has been established, it sort of becomes an anchor for the level. If you establish it correctly in the level and you teach it correctly, then we can be confident that we can start throwing more complex scenarios at the player and more complexity and more variety at the player through the course of the level. And once you got enough of these scenarios strung together, you got a theme, right? So that brings us to our second rule. All critical path levels unlock a new ability. Put simply, these are distributed about every 90 to 120 minutes or so. And as above, these are the unique gameplay elements that drive the theme throughout the level. Most importantly, since a new one's unlocked every 90 to 120 minutes, it helps the level to make it feel different from the one before it, and it helps the level to make it feel different from the one after it. It's a lot of good variety, it prevents a lot of blandness, right? Which is always a little bit of the fear. Making bland levels is not great. So you pair these 2 rules together, you got a basic flow. Every level unlocks a new ability, and then we can use that ability to drive a theme throughout the level. And once we know our unique ability, the level designer can sort of go hog wild. We can start to think about how this mechanic will work with combat, narrative, and exploration. If it's a really great mechanic, it should be able to talk to all 3 of the most important elements of the game. Personal favorite of mine is the hook shot, right? Everyone loves the hook shot. You can use it to navigate, you can use it to fight, you can grab rupees with it, you can solve puzzles with it. The hook shot literally talks to everything in the game that is the most important elements, and that's why it is so meaningful to the player. And so if paced correctly and the items are meaningful, then players will actually get excited and anticipate the next big unlock. So here is the ability that's utilized in the stonemason level. It's called the shock arrow. And shock arrows are super basic. Shock arrows are magic arrows that Atreus can fire at red crystals, and they go boom. And that's pretty much it. But it's actually awesome because its simple design allows for a lot of versatility. If it's too complex a level mechanic, then we're really going to struggle to create a lot of variety or we're going to struggle to have scenarios where the player might be under duress and actually be able to use the mechanic. So its simplicity is actually terrific. So of course, before it looks like this in the game, we do a really basic prototype to make sure it's actually fun and that it's going to deliver on this potential versatility and variety. And here is the prototype. So this level prototype was actually created by John Marcello, who's one of the senior designers at Santa Monica Studio. We started this project so long ago, he actually used the touchpad as the prototype. And everyone thought it generally had potential. So from there, it went through some additional iterations to find out what the best controls and rules would be. We have a whole systems design department that are really masters of this domain. And then as level designers, we try to use those mechanics. But eventually, it was sort of determined that it would be even cooler if Atreus could help you out, right? We might get back a little bit more combat, exploration, and narrative. Maybe we can actually get father-son connection out of this mechanic as well. So it was added to Atreus's bow. Basically, you press square, and Atreus fires the arrow for you. It's pretty simple, but as I mentioned, our desire is to create father-son connection and also give the level designers a lot of versatility in scenario design. As you can see here, this mechanic is awesome because it can be used on tons of different stuff. And the red material, which does actually have some narrative in the game, it's kind of the roots of the Yggdrasil tree. So between visual development and the level mechanic team, and between the level designers and the environment artists, we're able to create tons of versatility as to how this red sap or this red material can be placed around the level. Spot on, because that's the thing that's going to allow us to create an established theme throughout the level. In addition, it was thought that we had a pretty good mechanic, but that we could get a bit of additional play out of it, once again, to push variety. So there was the decision made to add a throwable element, which is awesome. Now we can have static scenarios, and we can have scenarios that allow a bit more player creativity. And finally, once we're really happy with it late in development, we polish it so that it can accentuate its role and be a very prominent theme throughout the level. You can see here that it has an inner glow so that it pops just a little bit more, tiny bit arcadey. And you can also see that as you pass the camera around this object, it has a little bit of sheen on it so that it's likely to just catch your eye as you move the camera. So let's take a look at one of the scenarios in the level and how it works with the core pillars. Once again, try to think of this in terms of combat, narrative, and exploration. I'll start with narrative here. This sort of concept of a puzzle is great for slowing down the player and just having narrative moments in general. In fact, maybe after a little while, the AI partner can even give you a hint. This scenario is also terrific because it's been fabulously integrated by the environment art team. It's actually the ring finger of the giant, so it foreshadows the narrative that you're going to see further on. And you may not know this, but all the runes on the ring were actually translated by someone, so they all actually have real meaning if you go back and translate them, if you're really into the narrative of the game. So in terms of exploration, well, you can see here he's blowing up an additional secret, and that may not be exploration per se, right? It's not a super explorable space. You didn't find a hidden dungeon or anything like that. But really, it's kind of more of a gimme. It's a tutorial for exploration. It's teaching you, keep an eye out for future scenarios like this, and keep your brain checked for shock crystals, because shock crystals can equal secrets, right? And so this is a little bit of a gimme, but it does sort of train you on exploration. And then finally, for combat, well, the shock arrows are really great for combat in general. That was already thought of because Atreus can actually use them in combat scenarios, give you an advantage. They have a whole skill tree. This is where I love this scenario, because if you actually fire a shock arrow in combat at the ring, you can get an AoE and you can actually blast the AI. So everything starts to talk to each other, and you can even sort of experiment with it while under duress. That's part of the advantage of it being so simple. Now, you may not remember these scenarios. I actually showed you them at the top of the presentation, but a lot of the scenarios I showed you actually had shock crystals in the background. Let's take a look. You'll see that this is the first one I showed you, where it's just in the background. Maybe it hints to you that you can get a bit of damage if you're experimental. You can see that it can be used for throwable puzzles in the top right. Down below, it's actually used for a shock crystal chandelier section. And the thing that's sort of nice about the shock crystals is even though they are kind of big and glowy, we're able to get them into a lot of the environments. So they can even be in the background of cinematics without being like too offensive or anything like that. Let's take a look at it from a top-down perspective. Once again, you'll see that the shock arrows are really nicely distributed throughout the level. And I love that because that is the thing that is making it a theme. Some players even called it the shock arrow level when they would come out of playtest, which if you're a level designer is the real compliment, right? When they ignore everything else and just talk about the mechanics. And it was also great from a production perspective and a code perspective because as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, we can't code every feature ever. We're in a very fortunate situation to have so much support from Sony. But even still, we have limitations and we don't want to code everything ever. So using the shock arrow is still a very efficient use of the mechanic as well. So you can probably tell from my pride and joy with all these scenarios that I think the level designer Kai absolutely crushed it. I think this is one of the best themes throughout the game. This is what I love about level design. And he really nailed the flow. Level unlocks a key item, and then the level uses that item to create a strong theme throughout the level. But there is an additional detail to this. As I alluded to, every level unlocks a key item, right? And that starts to touch on how we think about more of the level-to-level experience and what the overarching experience is. So with that in mind, the next rule is all about creating a format. What is a format? Some people talk about format maybe like structure or something like that. I like to define it as the intuitive rules by which levels flow into one another. So if the pieces are lined up correctly, you can start to create some psychology and a mental layer. And players can start to identify with how they'll engage in sessions and how they'll play levels. In God of War, there's actually like a lot of different types of content. There's critical path levels, there's exploration levels, even little puzzles that are optional. There's actually entire areas you can discover on your own. So it's really important that we start to build some expectations in the player's head. If you enter a story mission in a game, how do you know intuitively that you're going to maybe start like 60 minutes worth of content and start to get into it? There's some psychology and consistency within the game to start establishing that rhythm in your head. And if you go down a side path and you think to yourself, oh, awesome, here I go, down this little side path. I know the main path's over there. Well, that means it was a correctly signaled B path. That means it was correctly set up through the level design to intuitively let you know that you're going down the side path, not the main path. Regardless, in God of War, we are often described as maybe having a bit of a Metroidvania element or something like that. And we often hear from players that they know when they can continue the story and when they can go exploring, which is great. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So our next rule works with all the previous rules before it to try and create those expectations and deliver on those results for the player. It's really simple. It's just about giving the player a clear exploration break. As I mentioned before, all levels, they give you a key item, right? And our exploration break is the opportunity for you to experiment with that. It's the thing that lets you know that it's time to go and use it in a more playful or free-form way. So I'll go into a step deeper on how that flow achieves basically the Metroidvania element. So in the previous level, as I mentioned, the theme is the shock arrow, and we try to deliver on that all throughout the level. But what you may not have noticed is that the shock arrow actually ceases around the 3/4 point in the level. On the way back out through the level, there's no more shock arrow scenarios. So what's the deal? Did we like run out of money or run out of ideas, something like that? No, this is actually where the boss battle takes place in the level. It's what you might describe as the key turning point. So going back to our triangle, the first 3/4 of the level delivers on the theme. And then we hit a key turning point. Now, it doesn't have to be a boss battle. It can be anything you want. It can be a key story moment. It can be a major chest or some kind of acquire. It can even be a revelation for the character. But what matters is the final quarter of the level is dedicated to teaching the new item or teaching the new ability. If done correctly, it's an embedded tutorial of sorts. It's sort of the type of thing where learning is fun, right? It's a hard thing to accomplish, but if you do it, then the player is sort of fooled into the fact that they're doing a tutorial. And then to wrap it up, our last rule finishes with an exploration break. So going back to our top-down map, the first 3/4 of the level makes up the shock arrow distribution. And then our boss battle here creates the key turning point. And then we use the last 25% of the level to reward the new item, which in this case is a magic chisel that he can use to unlock different doors around the game. There's 3 scenarios, so you confidently learn. 3 is always a great design number. And then finally, we wrap up with an exploration break. So in summary, we have everything we need now. We've created a strong theme, and we've given you an exciting item. We've taught you how to use it, and now we capitulate with an exploration break. What is the net result here? Why is this even important? Well, it creates a very natural motivator to explore. You are excited to go exploring because you got a new toy, and you only got to use it 3 times, so you might want to keep using it, right? It's brand new. And you're motivated to explore because you might have actually seen areas in the game that use this ability. That's great level design if we can plant it in your head as you go. And finally, you're given a very clearly signaled break. You don't have to worry. You know that this is a good time to explore. You know that this is a good time to go off the path. And you know this is a good time to confidently explore and experiment. To put it simply, it actually takes a lot of mental load to plan a path around an exploration space, to navigate by POIs, to look for secrets, to find things. And I want you to use your entire mental energy on that. I don't want you to be wondering if you know how to use an ability or if you know if it's the right time to be exploring. So by threading you in the back part of the level through the tutorial experience, we can make sure that when you go exploring, you have everything you need to go to the hub. Now here's how we achieve a format. You stack a few of these triangles back to back, and you have a consistent format that can be used to inspire and motivate from a level-to-level perspective. Our first level starts, we teach a theme throughout the level, we hit a key turning point, we reward a new item, we give you a clear break to explore. That item is then reutilized through the next level, so we can get a lot of value out of it. We keep pushing the theme throughout the level. Boom, key turning point again. Just as you're getting fatigued with that item, we try to give you a new item every 90 to 120 minutes, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. And if done correctly, players will start to learn this flow in the back of their head. If there's ever a pacing dip, or they feel like maybe they're tired of something, they will be excited and inspired about the next big item, or the next big unlock, and the next big ability. The promise of new and cool items also comes with the promise of varied themes and varied scenarios. Because we've shown you that these new items and abilities give you lots of different gameplay in the different levels, the flow is motivating. And most importantly, we can actually use that motivation to prioritize exploration. Here's a quick example. I want you to watch what the player does here as he boats around.
The taste of vanilla magic led him to new forms of experimentation. We're back. New levels of depravity. Look where we are, we're back.
Okay, so in this example, the player is exploring the hub. They've been correctly taught the shock arrow mechanic. And thanks to the design work done by Kai Zheng, they've also been told that shock arrows mean interesting themes and that there's a lot of different variety and a lot of different gameplay, right? So we've made a convincing promise to the player. So watch it one more time, and I want you to watch just what the camera behavior does.
The taste of vanilla magic led him to new forms of experimentation. We're back. New levels of depravity. Look where we are, we're back.
Boom, and there it is. He saw a shock crystal, right? He has been taught correctly. He has been promised interesting gameplay. And because he is returning to the hub, he is thinking, oh, I feel like doing one of those. I know how those work. I'm in the mood for one of those. Or he can just explore it on his own. That is the benefit. The result is that we do have a compass system, and we do have a map, right? But our hope is that players will be self-motivated, and that self-discovery will drive their exploration instead. It's good for players to feel motivated via UI or completion percentages. These are very valid design techniques and tools. But it's also good if players are self-motivated because they're actually seeking out interesting content. If this player likes shock crystal scenarios, then he can go and find more of them on his own. Players are trained that new abilities will be unlocked in the levels, and that in turn, interesting scenarios will be delivered. So the promise becomes more than just completion percentages. The promise becomes interesting scenarios. And that is pretty much our game's format. You play the level, you unlock a new item, you played a variety of scenarios. When you return back to the hub, you've been taught how to use it, you've been made the convincing promise of interesting gameplay. You can seek out more of those on your own if you like those types of scenarios, which most players did, especially in terms of the shock arrows. And then when you're ready, you can start returning back to the next level. So that is why we give players such clear exploration breaks, and that's why we set up so many expectations leading up to those exploration breaks. And now that we have a good, what you might call level-to-level flow or level-to-level philosophy, our last rule details the final tool we need to sort of tie it all together. It's about creating an overarching layout that can actually emphasize that psychology. The difference between a hub and an open world could maybe be a whole like GDC presentation of its own, right? There's a lot of different things to dive into there. But for today, what I want to talk about is how a hub, through its very physical design, mirrors the level-to-level flow that I've shown you earlier. It presents it as a playable layout, is the hope. And the hub is our way of creating information in your head as to where there's a playground for experimentation and exploration versus where the critical path will take over and continue the story. So with that, we're over to rule number 6. Hubs are not open worlds. Let's start with a quick definition of what a hub actually is then. A hub is a centralized location from which spokes emit. And so while an open world may offer a sprawling simulation or something like that, a hub is actually a very specific layout, and one that proved very effective for us. Here's a quick image of a hub. It's a pretty basic one. And using this and the definition here, you can see that the yellow center acts as a central location. The arrows coming out represent the spokes, and the blue circles represent the destinations or the endpoints, right? So a lot of people describe a hub as a wagon wheel. That's a pretty popular comparison. And using our definitions, we can start to run that through a quick sanity check. Central core, spokes, and endpoints. Or in level design terms, you could maybe recontextualize these, and you might call them a centralized site or pathways, and maybe the endpoints are destinations or levels or dungeons or something like that. Here's a popular example you're probably aware of, Shadow of the Colossus, one of the greatest games of all time. The player always returns back to the Colossus Temple at the center of the level. Then they start to go exploring, and they find more destinations on their own, and they're always reverted back to the central location, right? In popular culture, Disneyland is probably the most well-known example. It has the Mickey Mouse statue in the middle. You take pathways out, you find the different lands, as they are called. It's a very effective and fairly traditional level design technique, right? And one for us that I think was the perfect canvas for our level-to-level flow. So let's take a look at it in a quick example using the stonemason level. As you can see here, the temple in the center represents the centralized core. Coming off this is pathways. These represent the directional spokes to which the player can explore and go around. And finally, our levels and our dungeons, they sort of represent the destinations or the endpoints of the hub spoke diagram. So now we can test it against our hub diagram. You can see that's actually pretty familiar, not just because I matched the colors. And remember before, our level-to-level flow, establish a theme, hit a key turning point, earn a new ability or item, get a clear exploration break, continue, continue, continue. Let's run this against the stonemason level. In the previous level, the player goes up to the mountains, and they use the previous level's mechanic, which in this case, let's just call it orange to avoid spoilers. And they start to use this. It also creates a theme throughout the level. They hit a capitulation point, and they're rewarded with the shock arrow at the end of this level. The player can now make their way back to the hub. Having confidently been taught how to use the shock arrow, they can now choose to explore with it if they want. And then when they're ready, they can explore back for a quick narrative beat. There's a sort of mini mission that takes place here, a mini level. And when they're ready to go to the main critical path level, they head back to the stonemason level. We drive that theme all the way through the level, create a lot of variety, a lot more pacing, increase the complexity a little bit of the shock arrow scenarios. Boom, just as you're getting fatigued, key turning point, new ability or item, teach you 3 scenarios, and then you're back to the hub. And as we strip all of this away, it becomes apparent that this layout is very similar to the big wagon wheel. Overall, I believe the Lake of Nine was great at delivering the goals of a hub. And it's this hub design that in turn is really successful at achieving the sort of Metroidvania element that people often enjoy in this game. So there's your hub. And with that, we're back to our rule slide. I'll add it to the annex. Let's go through all of these and I'll quickly recap. It's also a good time to mention that these are actually sometimes really good design priorities. As you step through a really big project or a lot of work, you can also start to think of these as maybe the order of operations that you might want to take experiences on in a game. Up front is just about how we start to think together and how we work together to start creating some focus as a design group, whether that's technically designers or just people who we work with. Rule number 2 represents our desire to represent those core pillars as metrics. How are we going to construct effectively and consistently amongst one another? Rules 3 and 4, it's all about the backbone of creativity and the backbone of variety and pacing. Rule 5 ensures that we have clear exploration breaks and that levels flow clearly from one another. And finally, our newest rule number 6, it's sort of an overarching wrapper or an overarching layout for the whole experience. And with that, we have a game. But since it's GDC, and since we're here to learn about the tricky nature of development, I'll now step back through all of these and show you where they all broke. And not just because there was bad design, or not just because something was wrong. Sometimes it's also an opportunity. Sometimes maybe a problem just didn't work out the way we expected, or sometimes it's just common sense, right? So here's rule number 1. What you might have noticed is that this game has a lot of puzzles. And puzzles are not represented anywhere in the core pillars of the game. So what's the deal? Are puzzles a core pillar or not, right? And this is a question that took us about 4.5 years to work out. So even though the puzzles take a lot of work, and even though they do take a lot of playtesting, they're a great addition to the game because they let us tap into the 3 pillars of the game in really great ways. I like to look at the puzzles in terms of sort of emphasizers or subcategories of combat, narrative, and exploration. As I mentioned earlier, puzzles are great for just slowing down the action in general so we can get a lot of narrative between the characters. There's a lot more father-son teamwork in a puzzle, so that can be a good way to emphasize that pillar. In terms of exploration, puzzles often make us rethink the space, or they keep us in the space a little bit longer. At Santa Monica Studios, we truly do have some of the best environment artists in the world, so we're always looking for ways to get the player to soak in the space just a little bit more and try to appreciate the spaces, not blow through them too quickly. And finally, for combat, the puzzles actually teach you to learn. I'll show you one more time this scenario. This one is early in the game, and it's actually tuned a little bit difficult. Why? Because we would rather that you fail on the scenario a couple of times and learn how to throw the axe more effectively so that when you step into the more complex scenarios in the game, you have trained yourself how to do something that doesn't really exist in any other game. Throwing an axe and recalling it is fairly abstract. It's something that makes this game unique. And so by tuning this puzzle just a bit difficult, we can be guaranteed that sort of the types of players who will engage with stretch content or more complex content are also the types of players who might train and master more complex mechanics. So in short, puzzles are a big part of the game, but they're not a core pillar. Number 2, we are a metrics-based game. So the Norse landscape itself is really organic and really mysterious, and that was one thing that was very obvious to us from day one. But metrics are actually really rigid, and they're deliberately so. So how do you kind of tie these things together? There's a natural conflict that emerges, right? So here's a quick example of where it broke. I've shown you my favorite example, which is the 3-meter boost. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a lot of debris or shrub. So in the testbed, it looks great. You can see that it's a very clear perpendicular object. It's kind of turreted in this example, so we can accentuate the nature of it. But by the time we put debris over it, it sort of loses its ability to be an architectural piece. What now? What are we going to do? Get mad at each other, blame each other, scream at each other, go into each other's files, pull out shrubs? No. What we actually did is come up with a style guide. This indicates where shrubs and debris should actually be placed and where design metrics need to be kept important to keep things clear. Fortunately, we have an environment team who is extraordinarily talented and very passionate about the game. And you might think that pitching to a team, hey, we're going to talk about rules for shrub placement or where shrubs can't go, might be the most boring conversation ever. But actually, everyone really rallied together to talk about how we could create a style guide for shrubs. And the net result is that shrubs and debris can actually be used not only when they're removed, they not only make spaces very clear, but if you put them in certain places, they can actually act as a deterrent as well. So by creating these two style guide rules, we could actually basically create organic placement where we didn't want you to go, and architectural placement where we wanted to emphasize you going. So there's a lot of positive and negative visual expectations that you can actually create. Also, what about rules 3 and 4, variety? All levels have a theme, right? Not in the back 25% of this game. I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but the reason is twofold. Like, what's the deal? Did you run out of money again? Did you run out of ideas? Was like 4 years too long to make a game? Did you not want to go to 5 or 6? No, we don't have an unlimited budget on features, and we do try to use them as effectively as possible, right? And when we started to paper plan the game, we did realize that we were going to run out of mechanics and that we didn't have an unlimited budget and that we didn't want to spend forever, just prototyping and whatever. So the back part of the game are really more about mastery than about newness. Keep in mind, all of the level theming that I mentioned earlier, it's not specifically about creating new items all the time. It's about creating variety. And there is more ways to create variety than just adding more mechanics to the game. So here's a quick example. The temple flip level towards the end of the game is often, oops, sorry, let me get that up for you. Oh no. Well, the temple flip level of the game is actually often described as final exam. And what that means is that it uses all the previous level mechanics of the game together. And so let me get this back up and running. I think we've crashed. Oh, there we go. OK. So in this example, it's the only time in the game where Crusher Trap and Shock Arrow are used together. The reason for this is that the Crusher Trap is a one-hit KO. And so when we combine these two things together, there is a different emotion and more variety established through the combination of those two elements. So the deeper the player gets into the game, the more they know about the game, and the more you can promote challenge, strategy, and metagaming through the existing mechanics. And the net result is still interesting gameplay, right? It's still variety. Finally, I'll keep this one really quick. Once we had good level-to-level flow, players were still not really understanding, or certain players were still not really understanding where they could and couldn't explore. And we believed pretty strongly from a level design perspective that the hub was the right way to go, that we'd done all the right work, and that we'd created a good overarching format. But some players just really needed to be hit over the head that they could explore. They needed that final confirmation. So to solve this, we collaborated with the writers so that whenever the player re-enters the hub, they're given an additional line of dialogue from Kratos and Atreus, indicating that it might be a good time to explore. You can actually see here that whenever they step through these two doors, they'll get a little line of dialogue, and they'll say something like, hey, maybe we should go exploring right now. What do you think, Dad? But the thing is, we had to write them so many times so that it was never mandating the player to do so. And so with some of these things, it really does come down to playtesting and trying a variety of different lines and trying a different group of reads. Finally, hubs are not open worlds. Well, one interesting conflict here is whether we needed to align too much to the purity of a wheel-spoke format. Let's take a look at it one more time. You can see here that the hub spoke is a literal circle, right? Which is great on paper. It gives us a very clear understanding of how it's meant to work. It's a very clear design trope. It's very clear on what we're trying to deliver. But as you can see, the pure nature of a circle doesn't really give the environment team much wiggle room to deliver on the fantasy of a fabulous Norse lush landscape, right? So what we have to consider is, can we deliver on a hub if the elements are made a bit more organic? This is what it would look like if it was a pure circle, and this is kind of what it ended up like. So you have to start wondering, once we've got this structural center, and we have these pathways which are retained very clearly, how else can we accentuate the hub-like nature while also delivering on the organics? And the answer was that all around the Lake of Nine, there's these additional towers. And even though they may not necessarily create a pure circle per se in terms of a barrier, they do help to create an additional anchor that helps us emphasize the hub. So even though the level itself became more organic, there's still enough hub-like elements that we can retain the core design intent while also supporting the needs of the environment art team. So I mentioned at the top of the presentation that this project actually did have a lot of risks, right? And even though from a technical standpoint, areas like the Lake of Nine, which was created and led by Luis Sanchez and John Palamarchuk, they worked on it for a long time, and it was a huge technical task to get it up and running. But the nice thing about some of these design rules is that they're pretty easy for us to understand and get excited about. They're mostly what I would consider to be design classics. They're not that fancy. You can see how having a unique item and a lot of variety in each level is going to drive themes and make things fun, right? You can see how having a hub will be a good overarching wrapper to a game and to an exploration experience. And that's why sometimes going with a design classic is really great. Amongst all the technical challenges or additional creative challenges that we're trying to solve together, a design classic can sort of let you predict ahead a little bit. You're confident that it's going to come together, and you can focus a little bit more on the day-over-day challenges. So if I can leave you with one kind of wrap-up thought, it's this. I love a design classic. They let you create foundation. They're awesome. They give you structure, they give you canvas, all the building blocks for a game. But they are pretty much just that. From there, it's really over to the team and over to creativity and over to variety. You do need a strong foundation and you do need a strong design canvas, but a canvas is not inherently interesting on its own. So I'll leave you with one final rule. Because the thing that elevates a design canvas into an actual experience is a lot of creators coming together to add texture. Thank you. I think we have a couple of quick minutes, and I will mention at this point, we are hiring and we're trying to make a really big game again. In some form or another. We're always excited about new people joining the team, and they're not all from huge AAA backgrounds. A lot of people come from different backgrounds. Yes?
Hi. So one comment, one question.
Yep.
I liked how you kept coming back to the 6 rules card. That was inherently your hub in this presentation.
Thank you.
And then the second, the question is, and you kind of spoke about this at the end, but there was a very clear format for introducing new items, new abilities, and then carrying them forward. But could you speak a little bit about how you brought items, like legacy items, essentially that you'd already taught earlier in the game and brought them back later in the game type thing?
Yes, wherever possible, we try to make sure that the level has an overarching theme, but it should never come at the cost of additional variety. So mixing and matching previous levels' mechanics, as long as they're taught correctly, and as long as we have confidence that the player knows how to use them, again, you can create a lot of variety by mixing and matching those correctly. Right. So for example, Atreus and his rules are taught very early in the game, and those are leveraged all the way through the course of the game with additional mechanics.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, let's go with the left side, maybe?
Okay, so I was wondering actually, when you mentioned that you use metrics as a rule for the level design, did you also support it with analytics or some sort of thing like that? Or was it more like general metrical guidelines really for level design?
Yeah, we use a few Maya tools, for example, for the slopes to detect whether something is actually metric or not. For the most part, it is down to the taste of the designer and the environment artist to stick to the rules. If the game comes up with bugs, you'll know why, because it probably didn't hit the metrics. And the analytics are mostly used for player feedback and for combat tuning, testing, economy, and sort of more broader reaching things that are harder for us to test with our hands.
Gotcha, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm sorry if I spoiled this for someone. You talked about the central hub at a horizontal level, but one of the particularities of that central hub is that it's also vertical. It has a lot of verticality, and I wonder if you could elaborate on what went into designing that sort of like water temple-ish theme.
Yes, very early on, part of the fantasy of the Lake of Nine was that it would be a double-stacked hub. And that was a very early decision because, as you're alluding to, It's a huge amount of design work to plan for that and to account for that. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend retrofitting it at the last second because we didn't. And it was thought about for a very long time. There were many experiments and prototypes. In terms of the content, there's an overarching rule that it should be fun at level 1 and fun at level 2, but for different reasons. So at level 1, it's more about the questing experience and reminding you how to fight, teaching you the ropes of exploration in the game. And at level 2, as I mentioned, it's more about mastery, and it's some of the more difficult puzzles and difficult scenarios in the game. Since they're optional, that's great for us because a lot of the designers actually love building those more complex scenarios. So it was a perfect opportunity to put complexity with optional drive matched together.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned that you introduced a new mechanic or ability about 90 minutes or 2 hours, something like that. I was just wondering, how do you make it so a player doesn't get bored of it? Because a lot of times I've seen many games that you get a new ability and players just like that half an hour and they're all, okay, what's next?
Right. I think that's a great takeaway. The goal should not be to come up with more mechanics. If you run into that problem, the goal should be to evaluate whether you've created enough interesting scenarios. So as I showed you earlier, even just inside the pillar of combat, there's a lot of different versatility you can create inside that. If you're willing to add a timer to something or a death to something, you can take a look at that mechanic and start to think, what vectors have we not utilized this mechanic for already? And if players are saying they're bored, it might be the mechanic, but it might also be that the scenarios aren't pushing the player's brain in enough different directions, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. One thing that was quite amazing in God of War was the fact that with the collectible placement, when I was looking for them, I couldn't find any, and when I stopped looking for them, I usually ended up having 100% completion of levels, and it felt like you had like a really keen understanding of the player psychology, what they were going to look at. And could you elaborate on the processes that come with that? When did you added the collectibles? Were you looking at playtest and things like that?
Any collectibles in particular?
Ravens, mostly.
Which ones?
Ravens.
Oh, reverends. Okay, I would say, put simply, for some of the more bespoke collectibles, how can I describe it? The game rewards players who explore by beating the curve, right? Like, the game is not so huge. It looks bigger than it is if you actually look at the geo. So by circling around the space a lot, you may feel like you're discovering it on your own, but more likely scenario is that you'd just gone past that area a lot of times or that you'd stumbled across it a little bit. So for example, the language discs, most players feel like they discover them on their own, and players who go exploring will discover them. But there's an additional set in the critical path levels for players who didn't go exploring, and both groups of players will still stumble across those advanced collectibles together. For the runes, it's a little bit more complicated, but I hope I've given you enough to go on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think one more from each side, yeah.
In the level design process, I know it's really important, especially in a game like this, you have a heavy combat side, but you also have to really balance it out with puzzles, puzzles with the characters. At what point is it, you really went combat first really heavy, and then you said, well, let's think about the puzzles? Or did you immediately say we have to think about both evenly? And what was that process like for the team?
Great question. One of the solutions to this in the game was the triple chests, as they're called, or the Narnia chests. They are a terrific addition to the game because they don't impact the layouts or the environment art the way like a full room scenario would, and they let us look back at things that were maybe previously combat spaces that might not have as much adventuring or exploration in there as we'd like. And they were a particularly good way to sort of bring the balance together in areas that were sort of maybe mismatched.
Hi, so I was curious, given the way that hubs work and how shared the mechanics were across many of the levels, how difficult did that make pivoting in the design and direction for levels? Like, were there any special challenges with that?
Yes, and I would say that Santa Monica Studios is one studio where we value the environment art very highly and the workflow of environment artists very highly. So that decision to make a hub was extraordinarily early in the project. There were other different models that we looked at and other different ideas, But once we committed to that hub design, there was sort of no going back. We had to just really nail it, and all the way in the last 6 months of the project, it was nerve-wracking, but as I mentioned, Luis Sanchez, John Palamarchuk, and Florian Strauss, they really pulled through on it, and I really respect how much everyone just kind of stuck to their guns and kept going, because it was very integral to the game by that point. Yeah. Okay, last one, yeah.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for the talk.
Pleasure.
I was wondering if you have some guidelines in order to design side missions or optional areas. Thinking about what you say that at the end of every critical path level, you have to get a new ability. So how you could design side missions, making them like interesting and satisfactory to the player at the end?
I'll speak on behalf of our exploration lead a little bit here, and I hope I, express his philosophies correctly. He has often mentioned to me that he believes once there was a strong narrative thread through the side missions, that it really created a lot more drive for players, because they actually liked Kratos and Atreus as a partnership together. And when they lacked narrative, it was problematic. So the additional narrative through line of those side missions is critical. And also the reward tuning on them. If you have a bad reward at the end of those, if players are giving you a 1 through 5, if they don't like the reward, it doesn't matter what happened, they'll just give you a 1 or something like that if they didn't like the reward. So you've got to really get the rewards correct, and you really have to have, it can't just live on gameplay, there also has to be like a strong narrative through line as well.
Okay.
Thank you, and happy GDC.